Nursing Conversations. Today, we're focusing on inclusion, especially in the lactation space, and how nurses, midwives, and birth workers can care and support for gender diverse families. Our guests today are Jacob Engelsman, an infant care specialist, childbirth educator, and international board certified lactation consultant specializing in lactation support for gender diverse families. As well as we have Kristen Cavuto, a licensed clinical social worker in IBCLC located in central New Jersey, whose clinical lactation specialties are low milk supply, specifically insufficient glandular tissue, and other medical low supply issues. I'm your host today, Jennifer Peterman. I'm a clinical practice leader on the postpartum and well baby units and a lactation consultant, and here to ask you some questions. And I'm so excited for you guys to be here today. And let's get started with what brought you to the field of lactation, and why do you think it's valuable for babies to be given the opportunity to be fed human milk? Jacob, why don't you go first?
Great. Yeah, so what brought me to lactation is that I always knew two things, which is that I really wanted to help take care of babies, and I didn't want to have to go to med school. And because that's the thing is growing up, I always had this idea that if you were going to be a man who took care of babies, you were a pediatrician. But I was like, I don't want to be a pediatrician. I know me well enough to know that I have no business in med school. I will not, So I kind of figured out in my mind, like, what my ideal job would be. And I ended up with, and then I found out the word for that job. And the word for that at the time was postpartum doula. So I did some doula trainings. I did some birth doula trainings, postpartum doula trainings. I attended my friend's birth. I worked with some families in that way, and then I realized that kind of wasn't for me because that was more like taking care of parents, more like taking care of the adults, when really I want to be taking care of babies. So I got a job at a lactation clinic called Breastfeed Atlanta, and really just like as their secretary, I spent a lot of time cleaning pumps, scheduling consults, and arguing with insurance companies. And eventually, after about 6 months, the owner of the clinic was like, Jacob, you should just become an IBCLC. Like, you're already learning so much. Like, this is really, like, it seems like what you want to do, and you work at a lactation clinic, so you can get your clinical hours pretty easily. So yeah, so I submitted for Pathway 3 because before that I'd worked in like restaurants and food service, just because it's something you fall into and then you can just do for the rest of your life. But it wasn't what I really wanted to do. It wasn't what I was really passionate about. So I was part of the first cohort to take their test online during the pandemic. So, which on the one hand, doing the online test, it was a little buggy the first time around, as I'm sure everybody heard about, but it did get me 6 more months to study for the test. So, took the good with the bad. And ever since then, I've been working mostly telehealth. Once things, when everybody started doing telehealth during the pandemic, I kind of stuck with that because my client base is mostly people, gender diverse families who are like seeking information about lactation or who are inducing lactation. It's not usually a situation where I have a parent who has a hungry infant and there's something wrong. Those people I refer to in-person consultations wherever they may be. As far as why why I feel like human milk is so valuable to babies, it's interesting because in a lot of these, I do a lot of interviews with my book coming out, but most of them are I'm speaking to lactation professionals. So nobody ever asks me that because that's preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
But yeah, since we do have a pretty limited amount of time, I feel like the short answer for me for why human milk is so important for babies is antibodies.
Hmm.
That's kind of the main thing that no no formulas can replicate.
Exactly.
And of course there are other ways infants get antibodies, just skin to skin contact, just being around, but that's to me, like, short answer, that's the fundamental difference.
Great answer. Thank you, Jacob. How about you, Kristen? What brought you to the field of lactation?
Well, I was minding my business and having a perfectly lovely career as a psychotherapist. And then I had my first child and I had a lactastrophe. I did not coin that term, but I love it. It turned out that I had IGT and medical low milk supply. And I didn't find that out until after I had seen 6 different IBCLCs and no one had even done a weighed feed. And so I did not get the care that I needed. And so I had a 6-week-old baby that was below birth weight with red brick dust diapers. And my pediatrician was threatening to, report to Child Protective Services. It was a pretty bad situation. And finally, I was referred to an MD IBCLC in my area who figured out what the issue was. And I got passionate about it. My son was born with only one ear, and so I felt that it was really important that he get human milk to preserve hearing in his other ear to avoid ear infections. So I think that's one of the things that kept me going. About 2 years after he was born, I became a La Leche League leader. I thought it would just be some fun volunteer work while I stayed home with my kids for a few years. But I kept learning more and kept learning more and decided to go back to school and get retrained and take the test to be an IBCLC. So I did that in 2010. And since then, I've had a dual private practice, both in psychotherapy and in lactation consulting.
Excellent. Both areas that need support.
Absolutely.
Um, so, what unique challenges do gender diverse families face when they become new parents? I'm sure it's not just with lactation. Gender diverse families face a lot of challenges. Can you elaborate on some of them? Go ahead, Jacob.
Well, as you were asking this question, I was thinking, like, as the one of us who is actually a parent, Kristen, why don't you take that one?
So, from a personal perspective, personally, I can't speak to gender diverse families with infants because while I was certainly out as queer when I had my children, and I was also out as being ethically non-monogamous, which certainly came into another aspect of my queerness that came into effect at that age. I was not out as gender diverse in any way back then. I can say that the people that I work with now, there's a lot of challenges. Medical bias is certainly one. Issues with family is another. I think the biggest problem, though, when it comes down to it, is a pretty serious problem. Is people are afraid of losing their children. People are afraid of having their children taken from them, especially now, and it's a real concern. They're not being. It's not paranoia if they really are out to get you, and I think that sometimes, all marginalized people are afraid of going to medical professionals sometimes because they're afraid that that medical professional will just be another arm of the state in that way. So part of one of the reasons why I want to do things like this, why I think Jacob's book is so important, why I think it's so important for us to educate nurses and other perinatal healthcare professionals is because we need to be able to reassure our clients that we are not going to participate in the dissolution of their families and that, putting their families in danger.
That's a great point. You touched on Jacob's book. So, Jacob, you wrote Lactation for the Rest of Us, a guide for queer and trans parents and helpers. Can you give our listeners who are perinatal, neonatal nurses, nurse practitioners, midwives, some tips on how best to support our LGBTQ families?
Yeah, so I feel like one of the fundamental ways, one of just like the basic ways you can be, people can be more supportive. And of course, this is coming from the assumption that like you want to be more supportive, right? That you want to be a better ally. One of the best ways to do that is to meet your patients kind of where they're at, even just like in terms of language. One of the examples that I use a lot when I'm talking to lactation consultants is that a lot of people have a lot of feelings about terms like chest feeding or body feeding, but it's perfectly common for people to go to a lactation consultant. The consultant starts the consultation using very clinical terms like, you know, breast and areola, what have you. But then when the patient starts talking about their boobs and their nips, the lactation consultant, you know, switches gears to make sure that everybody's more comfortable. And so doing something like using the term chest feeding, if that's what your client or patient is using, you know, it's no different. It's just maybe a term that isn't already in your repertoire.
So, can you tell us? I know we talked a little bit about, you know, I think you mentioned earlier about inducing lactation. Can you tell us what areas of your book you focus on, like in your guide to lactation journey? What kind of different areas? I don't want to speak for you. Do you talk about?
Yeah, so the book is really, there are three main parts. One is, and most of it's written in like a Q&A format. And so one part is just basic lactation questions that any parents are going to have, questions about galactagogues, questions about like, should it, you know, should it hurt? What is this pain? When should I go see a lactation consultant? What's donor milk? That kind of stuff. Just your basic run-of-the-mill kind of questions. Then there's another section that specifically references concerns from transmasculine and non-binary parents, which are generally questions about binding, questions about testosterone, and questions about top surgery.
Can you just tell our listeners what top surgery is, in case they're...
Yeah. Top surgery is when somebody has chest tissue removed, and generally it's usually different from like a mastectomy that you might have if you had a tumor, because it's focused on like the shape of the chest, making it look more masculine and not just removing the tissue. And so there's a lot of questions about like, can you lactate after you've had top surgery? And it's interesting because I always get questions. It's always from one of two groups of people, which is either 20-year-olds who want top surgery but also feel like they might want to give birth one day and want to know if they should wait, and that sort of information. And then older parents who are, you know, like mid late 30s who had top surgery 20 years ago and are now pregnant and want to know about lactation. And of course, the thing is that all of us know is that the hormones responsible for lactation are made by the pituitary gland, or regulated by the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland doesn't know if you've had top surgery or not. You give birth, your body's gonna make milk. It's just a question of what happens to the milk afterwards that that I talk about in the book.
So I feel like that is giving people hope. Like, I think some people think that they couldn't breastfeed at all, and just knowing that that is, that there is a possibility that they can, I think that just giving people that hope can be really valuable. Um,
And
Go ahead.
from
Oh,
and
and then, oh, go ahead, Kristen.
just to that point, I was going to say, as someone who has not had top surgery and has IGT, I can say that working with someone who's had, chest tissue removed, glandular tissue removed, is not that much different than working with someone who just doesn't have enough glandular
Yeah.
tissue to begin with. There's ways to increase it, but there's also ways to be successful at nursing your baby that have nothing to do with the amount of milk you make. And was an important part of my journey, an important part of many of my clients' journey, whether they have low supply for a variety of reasons or they have low supply because they have had top surgery.
I think what's important is that it's not all or nothing, right?
It's
Like I
it's
Yeah.
think that is the the gist of it, that you
mhm.
can make something successful. Jacob, you said there were three parts to your book. What's the third
Yeah,
part?
yeah. So then the third part is about inducing lactation,
Mhm.
which again, it's kind of the same information for uh, cis women and trans women. There are differences in the overall protocol, but really it has more to do with the fact that somebody is whether somebody is taking hormone treatments or not, right? Regardless of whether or not they're trans, people take hormone treatments for all sorts of reasons. That's definitely going to affect your inducing lactation.
Mhm.
So,
And
go ahead.
oh, and then so I talk about that aspect of it, and then also I spend a lot of time talking about pumps, different kinds of pumps, what all the different terms mean, how often you should be pumping, all.
I think for any lactation consultant, pumping is like the thing, right? Like that's the thing to keep it all successful. Um, I think people latching and everything else is important, but you don't want to forget about how important pumping is, especially when you're doing something like inducing lactation. Or
Right. Well, where you're basically tricking your body into thinking you have a hungry baby.
yeah, Kristen, you're also a therapist. A couple
Mhm.
years ago, I took your class on mental health first aid for perinatal providers. I thought you had great insight on some of the unique mental health challenges new families face. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but can you talk about some of the challenges that, like stigma, and how maybe nurses might be stigmatizing people that want to induce lactation or have non-traditional, um, family roles, and they might not be aware that they're even doing it?
Mhm. Sure. So what's interesting is, and I'll talk a little bit about nurses in the inpatient setting when someone is giving birth, but there's also, nurses who are also lactation consultants outpatient. Um, What's interesting is that I really do think that a lot of the sort of microaggressions, the biases that um, LGBTQ people and trans people in particular are facing are not necessarily overt bias. Of course, some of them are. Some people are always going to be awful. Um, but I think a lot of them are just habit. And nurses are very busy people. Inpatient nurses are very busy people. And when they are used to doing things and saying things in certain ways, they don't often just think in that moment. I'll give you just an interesting example. I once accompanied a friend of mine for her C-section. I was her birth partner for her C-section. And we not only, am I not someone who looks like a man, we weren't married. I was there as a friend. And consistently throughout the entire experience of, being gowned and being brought into the room and being talked about, I was referred to as dad over and over and over again. Um, and then about half the time they would look at me and go, "Oh, I'm sorry." So it wasn't a matter of thinking that I was the father of the baby, or even thinking necessarily that I was her partner and being deliberately biased.
Mm-hmm.
It was they were so used to saying the word dad in a situation that somebody was accompanying someone into the delivery room that they just didn't even think to say something different. So I do think that happens a lot. I think people tend to walk into a postpartum room and immediately say mom to the person who's on the bed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, and I've seen them say it when that person has a beard. which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it seems to be habit. So I think nurses need to ask questions that are relevant. So relevant questions. Asking questions is sort of a interesting line to walk. We want to ask questions. For instance, we can always ask somebody what their name is. You can always ask somebody what pronouns they use. We can always ask somebody what parent name they use. That's really important. People have different parent names, and especially queer families are going to have different parent names sometimes than what people are used to. So just ask. Those are things that are always okay to do. I do want to say that some people will ask questions that are not appropriate. So it's not appropriate to ask questions out of prurient interest. For instance, if you're taking a medical history and you need to know somebody's transition history for medical reasons, that is a reasonable medical question in that setting. You know, to say, what hormone treatments have you been on throughout your life? What surgeries have you had? In a medical context can be reasonable. But if you're just asking what they have in their pants because you just want to know, that is an inappropriate question. It's none of your business. And that will, especially in a medical setting, that often goes for somebody's partner. If somebody's partner is noticeably trans in a way that you think that you know what you're talking about, because remember, you can't tell most of the time even, and you may be wrong in a lot of cases, you don't need that information. That is not a medically necessary question. So again, I want to encourage nurses to ask questions that are polite, ask questions that are medically relevant when they need the answers to them, but be careful not to, you're not looking for gossip to share with your friends, right?
Right.
You're not looking to go out to the nurses station and saying, guess what patient XYZ just told me about their medical history. So we want competent care from people who don't look at us like zoo animals, basically.
Yeah, that's a great point. Jacob, have you had any of your patients that you consult with? Have they come to you with anything like that, where they've experienced stigma or bias from the nursing or medical community? Like any specific examples of that you can think of?
So, not okay. So this isn't regarding one of my patients, but I'm working on another book where I specifically talk to medical professionals about their experiences as patients, right? Because every doctor is also a patient at some point in their life, and right. So I'm speaking to gender diverse and queer medical professionals about their experiences, either through their education or their experiences as patients. And yeah, like all of them have stories to tell, and some where it's very like eye rolly and, oh, can you believe this doctor did this? And some where it's like a person who was like telling me a story about when they were a teenager, and had broken their arm. A doctor or a nurse, somebody at the hospital, asked their family to leave the room. As sometimes happens, especially with children, if there's, you're concerned about an abuse situation or something, ask the family to leave the room and then ask the person, can I see your penis? Because they thought it might be interesting. And this person was like, I don't have a penis. Like, what? Also, no. Like,
Yeah.
yeah. And like,
Also,
I don't
broken
know. I don't
arm.
know if they
Maybe
were
deal with
literally a
that.
child. Yeah.
And
I
I
don't know
think
if they
that-
were literally a child, but they were literally a teenager when this happened.
Yeah, and I think that goes to what Kristen's point is. Don't ask something that you don't need to know.
Right.
You,
It's a broken
what
arm.
do you need to know in the moment to take care
Yeah.
of this family, right?
Yeah.
It was
What do you
purely
need to know?
prurient interest. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
and I think that does get the best of people. So I think there's a lot we can do to be better as medical professionals, and I think do you either of you have done so much work and training advocacy work for this community? Where can some of nurses or our listeners go to maybe learn more or enhance their clinical practice or become better allies or all around?
So I actually have a workshop on lactation education resources about um, improving gender diversity in clinic spaces. It's based on a talk that I did for U.S. Lactation Consultant Association, but it's kind of geared towards all medical professionals about how you can make your clinic space more inviting for gender diverse patients.
And we'll make sure we put that link in the show notes.
Oh,
All right, so
great.
make
Thank
sure
you.
we have that because I think that sounds like a great resource. But keep going. I'm sorry.
Well, and then also I've got like this list of books that I can recommend. Do you want to say something first, Kristen, or should I?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so the books that I kind of refer people to when they want to know more about this. One is a book called Trans Bodies, Trans Selves, which is written by a conglomeration of people about. It's not strictly medical. It's a lot of social information, and people talking about their transitions. A lot of memoir, a lot of art, but that is a really moving book. And then specifically in terms of childbirth, there is a book called Supporting Queer Birth by A.J. Silver. And who, I guess, full disclosure, I interviewed AJ Silver for Lactation for the Rest of Us. I also interviewed Kristen for Lactation for the Rest of Us. And a book called Rainbow Parenting. I am 90% sure how to pronounce this author's name, so I'm going to try. Rainbow Parenting by Linz, Lindz, Amer, Amer. But those are two books that I really recommend to people. Are good, very accessible works. It's not a lot of high level gender theory in it. It's just for people who, yeah, want to be better allies.
And then how about since we're on the topic of books, Jacob, when does your book come out and how can people find that?
My book is being published by Jessica Kingsley Publishers. The official launch date is February 21st.
Okay.
And I have an event scheduled, and it's in Atlanta, Georgia, but it's hybrid, so you can also attend online. It's on February 27th, and I can make sure you all have a link to that.
Okay, great. How about you, Kristen? What are some trainings or advocacy that you think nurses could go to become better allies?
Um, I think I mean, obviously, I think all the books
A
that
lot.
Jacob recommended are important. I think there are a lot of trainings, and I think what's important is when nurses are looking for trainings, that they're looking for some specific things. So, for instance, the person giving a training about LGBTQ issues should be part of the community. So that's the first thing right there. Um, we're looking to make sure that even within that community that it's somebody who is inclusive of trans people, also inclusive of bisexual and pansexual people. Those are sort of red flags for somebody who starts saying some pretty crazy things about those two communities, even within the gay and lesbian community. So there's some, things to look for sure. Um, there's a lot of people giving good education nowadays around this topic. I don't think it would take too much for people to find them. Um, I will say that I do want to speak a little bit just to say that I know a lot of people, a lot of nurses, people who in their own nursing journeys, in their possibly, their parents or even their grandparents' nursing journeys were involved in La Leche League International. And that was an organization. I was a leader for 15 years and was sort of pretty deeply involved in helping to change that organization and their policies around family inclusiveness. um, do I recommend La Leche League to queer parents? It's a complicated answer. I do recommend following the La Leche League USA social media pages. They are decidedly and reliably inclusive, and have been for years. Um, the La Leche League International has become and dragged kicking and screaming into it, but has made some decisions around inclusivity over the last 3-4 years that have been positive. So I want to give credit where credit's due when old organizations make changes in the right directions. When it comes down to individual groups and referring clients to them for support, you need to know the culture of the group in your area before you're referring queer parents there, before you're going there for education. Um, so it's really a matter of talking to the leaders, the individual leaders in your area, and finding out, is this group queer inclusive? Is this group trans inclusive? What's going to happen if someone calls a leader and asks for help with inducing lactation as a trans woman? What's going to happen if a trans man who's given birth shows up with his baby and his beard? Are they going to be welcome? Are they going to be able to be part of the group and enjoy that support? And it really is group by group and place by place, even within the same state. So I want to give credit where credit is due in that there has been change. But I also want to give that with the caveat that there's still a lot of places, both in the US and internationally, that are not safe for queer and specifically trans people.
I
And
agree.
places don't get the benefit of doubt.
I've experienced that too for referring patients out. And I think sometimes it's hard to know, like, is there a good database or one-stop shop where you can have some patients to?
So I will speak a little literally, and then I'll just speak about in-person and online lactation support groups in general, because there certainly are more than just that. Um, in the United States, there are two different La Leche League groups of states. One is La Leche League USA, and one is called Alliance. Alliance has deliberately not passed rules involving inclusivity, and USA has deliberately passed rules including inclusivity. So one of the ways to find out if you're more likely to have an inclusive group is to find out what state you're in. But again, even within that, I would suggest you need to at least make a phone call or send an email before you send somebody to a specific group. When it comes to other lactation support groups, which again are so important for community building, so important for people getting real help on a regular basis, and this includes local IBCLCs, right? It's so important to have know your local resources, know those support groups, know your local IBCLCs, but when it comes to your queer families, you need to know who's safe to send to, because it's not, you don't just give them your big list.
Yeah.
And that involves individual relationships, and that involves nurses who, let's say, work in postpartum in a hospital, not just handing a piece of paper out, but doing a little due diligence and making, a few phone calls and asking some people, looking at some websites maybe, and saying, like, are these people explicitly inclusive? And are these safe referrals for my families?
I think that's a great point. And just go ahead, Jacob.
Well, and asking somebody if they're inclusive is one thing, but asking other people, like, what's their reputation? Like, they might even think they're inclusive,
Sure.
but then they say a whole bunch of stuff.
Yup.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an extremely good point, Jacob, because I think we've all seen people who think that they are inclusive or something, and then their actions are a little bit different.
And it's worth saying in the lactation space in particular, perinatal space in particular, that there are many providers that are very supportive of, for instance, two-mom lesbian couples, but who are very overtly biased against trans people in particular. And they are someone who you might see a rainbow flag up on their website, and they're still not a safe person because they have some pretty unpleasant views around trans people. So it's important to get that information.
Well, today the one thing that I've gathered from listening to both of you speak today, which has been very helpful, was that lactation is possible for patients that are gender diverse, that and that there is room for nursing to be better, advocates. Nurses are advocates. And I think, like Kristen was saying before, sometimes things are, you're used to saying, mom this, mom that, congratulations, mom. Being open to changing what you're used to is possible. And that there's a lot of different avenues out there that you can turn to be a better ally and to be more inclusive for your patients. Was there anything that either of you think that nursing, in perinatal nursing, nurses need to know that we didn't touch on it at all today?
I'll just remind everyone this. There was a study done on elderly women who had given birth 40, 50, 60 years earlier, and they were asked what they remembered about their experience giving birth and after they gave birth. And universally, what these older women remembered was not the competency of the skill set of their provider. They remembered how the person made them feel. And nurses have so much power to make somebody's perinatal experience beautiful and empowering, and they have so much power to make it disempowering and hurtful. And so nurses get to choose to use that power how they see fit, and remember that what they do will influence somebody emotionally for literally the rest of their lives.
Such a great point.
Right. What's Tuesday for you is the most important day of their life.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Well, thank both of you. And to our listeners, please visit awhon.org/podcast to read more about Jacob and Kristen's bios and utilize some of the resources that they talked about today. We'll have up on the website. You can watch, re-listen on YouTube and multiple streaming platforms. Feel free to recommend an episode or two to a friend and leave a comment about your listening experience. Thank you, everybody. Thank you both for being here today, and thank you for our listeners. Thank you again. Be well and be safe.